Who do you think allows you to live like this?
My son, drenching me with the beer he was holding, uttered those words as he looked at me, soaked. Rubbing my beer-stung eyes and shivering from the cold, my son showed no sign of concern, only fueling his anger further. I'm done. I clenched my palms and glared back at my son. My name is Elizabeth. I'm about to turn 60. I raised our son Christopher with my husband William, who is 5 years older than me. But as soon as our son graduated college, he left home. We were enjoying our life as a couple until recently, when my husband started complaining of chest pains and went for a checkup. Told it was impossible at the small local hospital, we got a referral to a bigger hospital nearby. The results suggested that an even larger hospital with specialists would be better, so we started going to one in the city. Seeing a specialist meant we needed regular visits, and depending on my husband's condition, hospital stays were possible, which worried me. Just getting to the hospital took 2 hours. With the cost of time and money for visits, and needing checkups every 2 weeks, the financial burden was significant. Weighing the cost of travel against moving, we concluded it was cheaper to keep visiting the hospital. So we moved to a small apartment closer to it. Life in the new place was tough. Despite our savings, city living was expensive. My husband, who had worked all his life, had to rest, leaving me to find work. But finding a job was hard at my age in the city, and I ended up as a cashier at the only supermarket that would hire me, supporting our family through hard times. On the way back from a routine hospital visit, Dad, Mom. I turned around to a voice from behind, and there was Christopher, whom we hadn't seen in over a decade. We never lived a luxurious life, but we thought it was modest and peaceful. Yet, our son had always been dissatisfied, and upon landing a job at a big city corporation, he declared, "I can finally escape this suffocating countryside. I won't end up like this, living in poverty. I'm cutting ties and never coming back." With those parting words, he left home and we lost contact. Years later, we unexpectedly met him again after a hospital visit. As I struggled with what to say, my husband suggested, "There's so much to talk about, and it's lunchtime, let's go eat." So, for the first time in a while, the three of us went to a nearby restaurant. Over lunch, we updated Christopher on our lives, and he said, "Please, let me live with you." Surprised by his sudden request, he started explaining. He had clashed with his boss and, after a recent altercation, quit his job impulsively and was now job hunting. His encounter with us was unplanned, and seeing us after struggling alone, he asked to stay with us. Considering he had left home so confidently and was now in this state, we agreed to live together under the condition he pay half the rent and utilities. At the end of the month, after taking my husband to the hospital, I returned home to find Christopher had also come back from job hunting. "Christopher, the rent and utility bills are due soon. Can you give me your share for this month?" I asked, but got no response. Thinking he hadn't heard me, I asked again for the money, but he said he didn't have any right now. Moreover, he refused. "I've just moved in, so I'd like to be exempt from this month's payment." Struggling with just our part-time earnings, we were barely getting by, so I pressed, "That's not what we agreed on." To which my son, astonishingly, threw only $50 at me.
"Shut up!"
Shocked by his action of throwing money and not nearly covering the amount, all I could do was listen to him mutter complaints barely audibly. Afraid to even ask my son in his current state, I mustered the courage to,
"What about the rest?"
When I inquired,
"You're greedy. I'll pay the rest later."
He yelled and stormed out of the house. As expected, or unfortunately, that $50 was all he paid that month. This situation was completely different from our original agreement, and since we were not living a comfortable life, it became financially very difficult for us. But the following month, and the month after that, my son continued to refuse to pay, claiming he had no money, and occasionally threw a few tens of dollars at us whimsically. Despite not paying rent or utilities, he ate more than anyone, stayed up late with the lights on, and spent longer in the bath than anyone else, doing whatever he pleased. As a result, our living expenses more than doubled since we started living together. We couldn't continue living like this. Finally reaching our limit, we tried to kick him out for not keeping his promises. However, when we tried to evict him, he would kick and punch the furniture and became uncontrollable. My son was big, and neither my husband nor I could restrain him. To make matters worse, once he got upset and started rampaging, he would stay in a bad mood for a while and become easily agitated again. We tried locking the door and putting on the chain while he was out to evict him, but when he couldn't get in, he banged on the door and made a scene. He even called the police, claiming his family had locked him out, so I had no choice but to apologize to the arriving officers. Living with a ticking time bomb was tough, but knowing his personality, I knew there would be more troubles ahead. We decided to properly educate our son, who was ours after all. To cover the increased living expenses caused by our son, I increased my part-time job hours. 3 months later, our relationship with our son remained the same, but my husband's health had significantly improved. We gradually reduced his hospital visits from 2 to 3 times a week to just once every 6 months for observation. On the way back from that checkup, my husband and I held hands, relieved that we had finally reached a milestone. We couldn't afford a lavish meal at a fancy restaurant, so we decided to celebrate modestly at home. But to avoid having the dinner eaten by our son, we opted for a slightly extravagant lunch instead. We stopped by the supermarket and added some expensive meat to our cart, saying, "Today is a special celebration." My son had gone out for a job interview, so he wouldn't be back until the evening. "While you're in the bath, I'll take my time cooking," said my husband. As the steak cooked to perfection and its delicious aroma filled the air, the front door suddenly opened. Just as I feared, my son had returned.
Wait, what are you doing here?
Before I could finish my sentence, my son said,
"Wow, nice meat,"
and took both of the freshly plated steaks.
"Hey! That's not for you,"
I yelled, but he didn't listen. He easily shrugged off my attempt to grab his arm and carried the steaks to the kitchen. He grabbed a beer bottle and started drinking without even pouring it into a glass. Then, without saying thanks, he began eating the steaks while standing.
"Enough is enough. You haven't even paid for this month's food, let alone the rent and utilities up to now. That was for Dad's celebration. I can't forgive you for this, even if you are my son."
At my breaking point, I shouted, and my son sighed deeply. Holding the beer bottle he had just opened, he walked towards me with long strides. I braced for a hit, raising my arms and closing my eyes, but then I felt my head getting wet. Instead of hitting me, my son had poured the beer over my head.
"Who do you think is taking care of everything here? I'm the one looking after Dad during the day so you can work. I'm the one who helps Dad with his baths. I'm doing enough work. And you're still saying it's not enough? Are you saying I'm useless if I don't pay?"
He raised his voice in anger, arguing how much he was doing for my husband and me. As I opened my mouth to argue back, he smashed the empty beer bottle on the floor. The breaking bottle startled me, and he immediately yelled,
"Money, money. That's all you think about, a greedy woman who can't appreciate being taken care of. Fine, then leave. You hate it because I don't contribute money, right? Just go."
Hearing the bottle break, my husband hurried out, staring directly at my son. I sighed deeply and looked at my son. I couldn't take it anymore.
"Fine. I'll leave by the end of this week.
Hearing this, my husband gasped in surprise and then hung his head deeply. My son, sounding inconvenienced, said, "You're staying for another week?" After a deliberate sigh, my son left the room without cleaning up, his footsteps echoing behind him. I began cleaning up the shattered beer bottle pieces, my wet clothes, and the floor. Along the way, my husband came to help. A deep sigh escaped me as I wondered how our son had turned out this way. A week later, we had packed our bags and were ready to leave the house. We had already shipped the larger items, and only small ones remained. After my husband left the house first, I looked at my son. He gave me a malicious smile and shooed me away with his hand as if I were a bug.
Get going, greedy lady. You're not a parent if you don't cherish the son who cared for you and treat me like a useless nobody just because I don't bring in money.
I wanted to hear that. Have you ever actually taken care of father? Hearing my words, my son's face turned red with anger and he began to rage. Normally, I would avoid provoking him, but knowing today was our last, I couldn't help but vent some of my frustration.
So, you're taking care of father, allowing me to work, right? But all you do is watch TV in the living room while I'm out. You even make father prepare your lunch. And bathing him? Don't tell me you consider putting father in the bathroom and playing games outside as helping him bathe?
Indeed. My son claimed to be caregiving, but in reality, he did nothing. I couldn't understand how he could so confidently claim to be caregiving when he was so indifferent towards my husband. My son shouted in response to my words, but he never specified what he did.
I'm looking after him.
Or,
thanks to whom?
He won't specifically say which one. Right. The meals, cleaning, shopping, and garbage disposal were all done by my husband and me. The most my son did was empty the fridge.
You're the one who said let me stay if I pay for utilities and rent.
Yet, you didn't keep your promise.
You claim to have taken care of things without doing anything. I tried to kick you out several times, but you always started rampaging, making it impossible. But today it ends. You need to decide what to do by the end of next month. Then you're free to do as you like. I can't take care of you anymore.
With that, I explained the situation to my son one more time and closed the front door in front of him, who looked like he might hit me. He didn't follow me. That night, I received a high-handed email from him.
Have you forgotten the kindness I showed you?
Or,
I'm willing to forgive you now.
Ignoring it, the next morning, I received another email insulting us.
The lowest of the low who abandoned their son.
That was it. About a month later, I received a barrage of calls and emails from my son. I didn't notice them because I was at work, but there were hundreds in the history. As I was astounded, I answered another incoming call.
Finally answering, huh? What's this about? Why can't I stay in the house anymore?
My son repeated desperately that he could no longer stay in the house.
Obviously. That house is on a 3-month renewal contract. I told you multiple times before I left that we weren't renewing the contract, so you couldn't stay there anymore, right?
My son seemed to have planned to enjoy living alone by taking over the house, but originally, we were living there on a continual 3-month renewal basis. Since my husband's condition improved and we needed fewer hospital visits, we decided to end the lease. It would be unavailable to live in by the end of next month. If he wanted to continue living there, he needed to sign the lease himself, which seemed to surprise him as if he was hearing it for the first time.
I didn't know that. You tricked me. Don't be silly. I explained several times, and even left the necessary documents for the lease change. If you want to stay in the house, sign the lease yourself. Otherwise, you can't stay, so leave before causing trouble with the management company.
I said this and ended the call while he was still ranting. I was pained to see what had become of my child. He was smart enough to get a job at a big company, but why could he only behave like a rampaging child? 3 days later, I left the apartment without renewing the lease. I received an email from my son. Apparently, my son, who hadn't been job hunting, had squandered the salary he saved from his previous job. Without a job and unable to pay rent, he had no choice but to leave. Seeing the text about returning to his parents' house, I hastily called.
Huh? You sold the house? It's my childhood home. How could you just do that? The house was too big for just the two of us. You left and didn't contact us for over a decade, so we couldn't even tell you we sold it. In the days when the economy was booming, we built a large, child-friendly house thinking of our son and future grandchildren. However, after our son stormed out, he never got in touch again. It seemed unlikely he would ever return. So, we decided it was best to sell the house to a family that needed it more. Then you should have told me when we were living together. Hey, give me the money from the sale. It was supposed to be my inheritance. I have a right to that money, don't I?
My son's absurd demands gave me a headache. Even if he was to inherit it eventually, the house originally belonged to my husband, and now it's owned by another family.
We've decided not to leave anything for you. We haven't given you our new address, and we don't plan to. We're cutting ties with you.
My son was dumbstruck and began to yell, but I hung up without paying any attention. Rubbing the pain between my eyebrows, I sighed deeply. Sometime later, my son was arrested. Despite all the explanations, he had stormed into the house of the family living in our old home shouting,
"This is my house! Get out now!"
Luckily, the residents were on guard because we had warned them about our son. They were well prepared and called the police the moment he tried to force his way in. My son insisted to the arriving officers that it was his house and, becoming infuriated when they tried to calm him down, he ended up hitting one of them. Breaking into someone's home, smashing windows, hitting a police officer. Naturally, he was arrested for several crimes. We apologized to the residents and the neighbors with cakes and asked them to keep our new address a secret. We used the money from the house sale and are now living in a small home in an unknown location to our son. The area is convenient for hospital visits, and with large parks and walking paths, it's perfect for walks. We hope to live peacefully and focus on our health from now on. My name is Jessica. I am 34 years old, living with my husband Brian, who is a year older than me, and our nearly 5-year-old daughter Mary. For some reason, over the past few years, I've frequently encountered troubling situations. For instance, when Mary had just started walking. She would insist on walking by herself or ask to be carried, changing her mind frequently as we hurried home from the supermarket. Then, a woman walking towards us stopped us, claiming my child had stepped on her foot. I apologized, surprised, but the woman was not satisfied and said if I couldn't manage my child, I shouldn't let her walk alone. Trying to keep the peace, I kept apologizing, but then she started demanding money for shoe cleaning and medical expenses for her foot. However, I had been careful to pull Mary close to me to avoid bumping into the woman as we passed. Feeling something was off and hesitating to pay, people started to stop and watch as it was evening and the street was moderately busy.
Should we call the police?
A kind-looking high school girl offered to help when Brian, who happened to be on his way home, called out from behind.
"Jessica! What's happening?"
As I began to explain the situation to Brian, the woman, realizing it was inconvenient for her now that my husband had appeared, left the scene.
"Lucky I didn't have to work late today. You had bad luck today." "Really? I'm glad you were here, Brian. Thank you."
And there was another incident on a different day. It happened on a holiday morning when I left Mary with Brian and went to the bakery. A woman seemed to be waiting for me to come out and persistently demanded the things I bought. That time too, Brian, who had followed me because Mary had asked him to, happened to come upon the scene and managed to fend her off brilliantly.
That was so scary. I'm so glad Brian came.
You have really has bad luck. I can't always be there to help, so you need to be careful. Brian has been incredibly reliable in warding off these odd women. Today, I'm driving to my parents' house. Brian loves me and our daughter dearly, and usually, we go out as a family, but unfortunately, he had to stay behind this time. Staying at Brian's parents' house during the end-of-year holidays has become a tradition. Then, we plan to visit my parents' house, but this year, Brian's work has been so busy that we had to postpone, and it's been hard to find the right time. Today, as I talked to my daughter sitting in the junior seat, I reattached to the passenger side for this occasion. Dad must be disappointed. Grandma said she bought lots of strawberries because she knows how much Dad and I like them. If Grandma says it's okay, will you give it as a gift?
That's right. As long as you don't eat them all by yourself.
Our drive is filled with conversations about Brian. After driving for a while, we park at a convenience store. Inside, we use the bathroom, and I buy orange juice and a small pack of biscuits. These biscuits are my daughter's recent favorite.
I'll give these to Grandpa,
she says, clutching them carefully as we head back to the car. Mary, why don't you drink some juice now? It's dangerous while the car is moving, I suggest to her before fastening her seatbelt. However, she shakes her head, saying the biscuits are for Dad and the juice is for Mom as a gift. Pleased with her thoughtfulness, I offer her some tea I brought from home instead. After making sure she's hydrated, I'm about to start driving when I notice my shoelaces are undone. Oops, hold on. My shoe is about to come off. I step out to retie them and stretch a bit after the long drive before getting back in. My daughter is quietly looking at something in her hands.
Mary?
When I ask, she's holding the dash cam. It came off. She must have been playing with it, and now it's showing today's drive in fast forward.
Oh dear. I've told you this isn't a toy.
Attempting to stop it, I accidentally pressed the wrong button. Switching the video to one featuring Brian. Oh, I pressed the wrong one. Dad's in this, but when was it taken? Without much concern, I'm about to press another button, when a strange man appears in the video, entering the car and starting a shocking conversation.
What's this conversation about?
I pause the playback and suggest a short break to my daughter, putting on a DVD of her favorite anime. After making sure she's entertained, I nervously play the dash cam footage with the volume low, listening to the conversation between Brian and the unknown man supposedly on a day he should have been at work. After watching everything, I change our destination to a nearby police station and rush in. The officers, surprised by my appearance, review the dashcam footage with me. Although it's too early for immediate action, they take it seriously and suggest staying with my parents for a while. They advise me to consult them again if anything develops, and I head to my parents' house, unsettled. Originally planning a 2-night stay to match my daughter's preschool schedule, we end up extending our stay after explaining the situation to my parents. As Brian's messages accumulate, I follow my father's advice and don't respond. Once ready, I call Brian, asking him to come on his day off, and arrange to meet at a venue owned by a friend of my father's.
Good evening.
Brian, seeing the reserved sign at the venue, looks relieved when our eyes meet, but soon wonders why our daughter isn't with me. Please, have a seat. Prompted by my father, Brian sits in the unusual silence without water being served, scanning the room nervously. Without the luxury of paying attention to his surroundings, I muster my trembling voice to speak to Brian. I want a divorce. Brian, taken aback by the sudden mention of divorce, appears completely clueless and refuses.
A divorce? What happened all of a sudden? Did I do something? I'm totally lost here.
Despite feeling terrified just being in front of Brian, I couldn't look him in the eye, but I had asked my father to observe quietly because I wanted to explain things myself. Feeling my father's watchful eyes, I pull out my mobile phone from my pocket.
Can you look at this?
The footage from the dash cam in the car was being displayed. Brian started watching the footage with a puzzled look and fell silent once he realized what the video was about. In the quiet store, a conversation between Brian and an unknown man flowed from a mobile phone.
Really, no need to hit him.
Just a little threat, and I think he'll easily get scared.
What if you actually hit him?
Don't worry. You can handle it. I'll meet up with you later and we can grab something to eat. Just approach him in the restaurant parking lot. If Jessica pulls out her phone, or you grab him by the collar, I'll run over like I just did and step in. Brian in the recording occasionally smiled but continued to speak seriously. He was giving instructions to a stranger to attack me and my daughter, even planning out a scenario where he would step in to rescue us. It was then I realized that this man in front of me was my husband. Acknowledging this made me start to tremble. Moreover, from the conversation, it was clear that this wasn't the first time my husband had orchestrated such an encounter. In fact, the odd women who had harassed us before were also sent by Brian, all to make himself appear good by rescuing us at the right moment. Lately, we had started getting used to being accosted by women, mimicking Brian's method of retort, so now he had sent a man to create a greater fear and save us, to boost his own image. From the video, I knew that this plan was set for the day we returned from visiting our hometown, where we had been staying. Brian watched the video silently, then pondered with his hand on his chin, looking down. Seeing him motionless, my father quietly spoke up.
Do you have anything to say?
Then Brian slowly lifted his face and exhaled narrowly.
Jessica, why would you make such a video? James, this is fake. It sounds a lot like me, but I don't know this man, and the content isn't true. You've been harassed by strange women before, right? You must be fantasizing about being a victim because of stress. I should have been more careful to look after you.
Brian offered a light apology to my father. I exchanged looks with my father and sighed.
This video will be submitted to the police as evidence.
Brian had always been kind to us, but there were many times when his actions were merely to create a good impression on others. As expected, he tried to convince my father with some excuse, exactly as I had anticipated. Hearing my firm declaration, Brian's attitude changed instantly.
Police! Are you kidding me? Are you trying to ruin my life?
A chair fell over with a loud noise. Brian stood up, swinging his fist to strike me. The moment I braced myself, my father and his friend, who had been hiding and waiting, grabbed Brian, stopping his movement. Then, men hidden in the store appeared one after another, their sheer presence quickly calming Brian down. Choosing this store as the place for the discussion was my father's idea, as he and the owner, a former police officer who opened the shop, offered their help. The owner, known for his strength, and his well-built acquaintances were ready to intervene before Brian could act, ensuring our safety and possibly serving as witnesses for the divorce. I had never been physically assaulted before, so I was grateful for everyone's help in responding quickly. Surrounded by friends, Brian had no choice but to sign the divorce papers I offered him without any attempt to resist or deceive. Later, I reported Brian's behavior at the meeting to the police, but, disappointingly, their response was sluggish. My claims of almost being hit, based solely on my perception and with no actual physical harm, along with the drive recorder footage being the only evidence of Brian's plotting, which was also an attempted act, made it hard to present my case. I couldn't provide any evidence regarding the women who had harassed us before. The difficulty in explaining such incidents, along with the fact that it was a domestic issue, led to a less than satisfactory consultation outcome, even though I managed to get a divorce. It took a considerable amount of time. Perhaps it was because I consulted a different department, or because the officer in charge changed during the process, requiring me to repeat my story, before finally being told to consult the police station in my home area. Exhausted, I decided to give up and return to my hometown. As I was about to open the door to my home, I felt a strong pull from behind. Stumbling as I turned around, there was Brian standing.
If you guys just come back, everything will go back to normal. I won't tolerate any more of your whims.
Brian, with force, tries to pull me and shove me into his car. As I scream and desperately resist, my mother, sensing the commotion, comes out to see what's happening. Noticing her, Brian doesn't even glance at my mother but goes inside to try and take our daughter. While my daughter and I are being forcibly pushed into the car, resisting along with my mother, someone from the neighborhood must have called the police because an officer arrived. But Brian, undeterred and possibly with his temper already flared, punches the approaching officer, trying to calm the situation. As a result, he is arrested for assault and obstructing an officer's duty, and we had to visit the police station again that day to explain our situation. Although we were released immediately, Brian would likely be in police custody for about 10 days, during which I hurried to move as I had been planning, arranging everything so Brian would not know our new address. And it seems my parents are known too. They decided to move out of our family home and into a rental property owned by my grandfather. Thus, amidst the chaos, the sequence of events that came to light unexpectedly settled down with Brian's arrest. Initially, Brian claimed during the investigation that he wanted to protect me and our daughter, to be our hero, but the women who had harassed me, when questioned, denied any such intentions. It was all a part of his self-production. Being the youngest of 6 siblings, Brian apparently rarely got his way growing up. Therefore, having a family and a home, he wanted to reign supreme, desiring to have his wife and daughter completely under his control. In the end, the hero talk was all pretense, with no real intention other than to create an image of himself as a protector and reliable figure. His true aim was control, insisting we obey because he protected us. Even the kindness he showed me and our daughter was solely to elevate his own image in the eyes of others. There was no real love for us, just a terrifying use of us as props in his performance. Now, I truly feel relieved that we are away from him. Eventually, only the charges for obstructing an officer's duty were acknowledged against Brian. Though dissatisfied that only the assault on an officer was recognized, since Brian was arrested, there was nothing more to be said. Then a friend of my father mentioned that had my husband's intentions went beyond abduction to harming us, and that prior consultations might not have been taken seriously. What if he had taken the child due to our arrival being delayed? Passing the buck between ask there, not here until another incident occurs. Would potential preventable incidents be ignored until actual harm occurs? Thanks to the warning given to the active duty officers, I feel a bit more at ease now. Currently, we're enjoying life in a new place, mother and daughter together, free from strange women meddling in our lives. My daughter thinks her busy father is living alone in our old home, but I plan to tell her about the divorce when she's older, keeping the details to a minimum. Days without Brian knowing anything about us are peaceful. The days ahead with my daughter are sure to be wonderful.